Nowadays, we're used to seeing a superhero movie hit theaters once every couple months, but back in 2007, after the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy had just ended, it was a different story. The Raimi trilogy proved that not only could you make 2 great superhero movies, but also that these things could rake in some serious cash. But with that story now over, they would have to figure out another way to tap into the budding superhero market. So after Spider-Man 3, what else was there to do beside wait 5 years and do it all again? I remember clear as day when I first heard that they were rebooting Spider-Man and the guy from The Social Network would be playing Peter Parker. It instantly clicked in my brain, and I had no doubt that he'd be a great Spidey. And again, clear as day, I can remember going to see The Amazing Spider-Man on the 4th of July 2012 and walking out of that theater loving Spider-Man just as much as I ever had before. And then I remember going to see The Amazing Spider-Man 2 my senior year of high school. I actually remember going to see it multiple times because I loved it so much. Both movies had fantastic web-slinging action with great music, and my boy Eduardo was killing it.
How about now? You still wired in?
But then something truly tragic happened to me. I started spending more time on the internet.
But these movies are fucking miserable to watch. They have little to no humor. They have almost no signs of life whatsoever.
The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is the worst movie I've ever seen.
Like its title, it really was amazingly shitty.
You don't have likable characters and charming, over-the-top performances.
So fucking bad that it turned into an unintentional parody of itself.
I would rather roll around in piss, blood, and vomit of an Ebola patient than ever watch this movie again.
Could it be true? Were these movies really that bad and I just never noticed? Comment after comment, video after video, I realized that this was no one's favorite take on Spider-Man. And I did eventually start to see what everyone was talking about. For some reason, the movies had a dark, Batman-like tone that just doesn't fit the character very well. They seemed overly concerned with setting up sequels and spin-offs, probably in an attempt to keep up with the MCU. This version of Peter felt significantly different from what we were used to at the time, and a lot of people had a problem with that. And that's just to name a few of the common complaints. After hearing about how bad these movies were, I looked for reasons not to like them when I watched them. And I think when you watch anything with that in mind, you'll find what you're looking for. But when you're a kid, it's kind of the opposite. When I was younger, I never really questioned whether or not a Spider-Man movie was good. I remember seeing Spider-Man 3 and loving it simply because I loved Spider-Man. He was infallible. I mean, how could I not like a Spider-Man movie? Now, I'm not trying to say that my lack of critical thinking was a good thing, but it did have its perks. Like how the saying goes, ignorance is bliss. But at the same time, I do think that sometimes we let other people affect how much we enjoy something a little too much. For example, imagine you're going to see a movie and on the way there you look up its Rotten Tomatoes score and it's 100%. Everyone's saying it's the best movie ever and it makes Citizen Kane look like it was written in crayon. Regardless of how much you would have liked the movie without knowing all that, you're probably going to walk out of that theater and say, hey, that was pretty good, at the very least. Obviously, there is a lot of valid criticism of the Amazing Spider-Man movies. There's just no denying that. But I feel like the hate surrounding these movies has kind of snowballed over the years, with everyone convincing everyone else to hate the movies just as much as they do. In a world where we love comparing different versions of Spider-Man, this one has unjustly become the punching bag of the group. Everyone's favorite version of Spider-Man to hate. And look, if you truly hate these movies and genuinely think they're garbage, then click off of this video right now. No, I'm kidding. That would actually be fine, and that's the point. All I ask is that for a moment, you look beyond all of the anti-Amazing Spider-Man propaganda you've seen for nearly a decade now, and see if you can't appreciate some things that these movies did with the character. And that's exactly what we're gonna do here today in this video. Even though these movies have their shortcomings, there are some things that I unapologetically love about them. So buckle up, hit like if you're enjoying the video, and let's talk about why I love The Amazing Spider-Man. So, to no one's surprise, there's something that we have to get out of the way right from the get-go. Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker. I can't remember for the life of me where I heard this, but someone once said that Andrew Garfield may not be the best Spider-Man, but he is the best actor to ever play him. And while I do think that Tommy's got a bright future, I'd have to agree with this. Andrew is obviously a very talented actor, and he meshes very well with this interpretation of Peter Parker. In fact, I'd guess that it was probably written around him to a degree. I think where Toby was more of the campy, nerdy type, and Tommy was more of the modern, nerdy type, Andrew just feels more like an outcast. He doesn't have a Ned, and he really doesn't have a Harry either. He's just kind of a loner. This Peter feels much more emotionally broken. On top of the usual Uncle Ben slaughter that we've all become so accustomed to, he was also abandoned by his parents when he was just a kid, something that he probably partially blames himself for. So he doesn't have any friends, his parents left him, and his uncle died, and it was mostly his fault. At the end of the day, the only people Peter really has to rely on are Aunt May and Gwen. I really can't imagine Toby or Tommy playing this Peter better than Andrew did, so you have to give credit where credit is due. Andrew captures this brokenness and really does feel like an angsty teen trying to figure his life out, which is even more impressive when you consider that he filmed the first Amazing Spider-Man at the ripe age of 30 years old. And the chemistry between him and Emma Stone is just perfect. I mean, I'm usually not one to care too much about the love interest in a superhero movie, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't invested in this relationship. Now, is this just because I have a big fat crush on Emma Stone? Maybe. But this romance really did feel like something unique, especially when you compare it to the precedent, which was Peter and MJ from the Raimi movies. Their relationship feels like a much more old school, girl next door type situation, which to me is a bit boring and outdated nowadays. In The Amazing Spider-Man, however, we have a relationship that feels a bit more real. Gwen is a scientist, just like Peter, so it actually makes sense that they might start hanging out and fall for each other. Gwen is also a little more tied up in the central narrative, since her dad is a cop who has the hots for the webhead. Oh, and Peter also tells Gwen that he's Spider-Man halfway through the first movie here. There's no need to do that thing where he destroys their relationship because he doesn't want to tell her. We've seen that, and I feel like this puts Gwen much closer to the story, and it opens it up for a deeper relationship between the two. Gwen helps Peter be Spider-Man, both physically and emotionally. Mark Webb, who directed both movies, was most well known at the time for directing rom-coms like 500 Days of Summer, so it's not surprising that the romance was done really well. It kind of reminds me of how Sam Raimi, who actually had a background in horror, was able to sneak an amazingly horrific scene into Spider-Man 2. I feel like this is most apparent in that scene where they first meet in The Amazing Spider-Man 1, which is both painfully awkward and heartwarming. Nowadays, you see more quirky romances like this one in movies, so it doesn't feel quite as unique anymore, but I personally loved it, and I think both parts were cast really well. Now, let's talk about possibly the only thing that we would all be able to agree that these movies do better than any Spider-Man movie, and that's the suit. And no, I'm not talking about this red and blue basketball, I'm talking about this beautiful work of art right here. The deep red, the big white eyes. Sure, it doesn't take a lot of risks, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. In addition to being a huge improvement over this monstrosity, it's also gotta be the best live-action Spidey suit to ever see the silver screen. And notice how I said live action, because we all know that if we were counting every Spidey suit, then this suit wins by a landslide, but we'll have to save that for another video. This suit was beautiful to look at, even in the CGI scenes. For example, this scene here actually shows the suit flapping in the wind as Spidey's doing a nosedive, and even though it's all clearly CGI, it makes it feel more real. At least much more real than the suit ever feels on MCU Spider-Man, for example. And this kind of brings me to the next point I wanted to make that might be the most controversial point of this video. The Amazing Spider-Man has the best action and web slinging we've ever seen in a Spider-Man movie. Of course, the Raimi trilogy was kinda held back by the technology of its time, and MCU Spider-Man actually hasn't seen a lot of New York web-slinging action. But let's take this scene from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, for example, which is egregiously underrated. People love talking crap about these movies, but they're quick to forget how awesome this was. In the scene, Spidey and Electro are facing off for the very first time in the heart of New York City, Times Square. The world is watching as Spidey attempts to talk Electro down. As a side note, even before the action breaks out here, I love this conversation between the two of them. Spidey actually remembers his name and tries to calm him down in a very friendly neighborhood Spider-Man way. But after the police intervene, Peter loses control of the situation. Electro sends a police car hurtling towards a group of people and also sends an electric current through the handrail of this iconic staircase in Times Square. To make matters worse, the webhead loses one of his web shooters in the explosion. Time slows down and the situation is presented to the audience as if it were a word problem from a math textbook. Suppose Spider-Man has two New Yorkers who are about to get barbecued if they touch this handrail. He also has a larger group of New Yorkers who are about to get flattened by a 2-ton vehicle flying through the air. He must save all the New Yorkers but is limited to only one web shooter. Show your work. Of course, Spider-Man, who isn't just known for being strong and acrobatic, but also a scientist, is able to think of a solution in time. He uses his thumb to split the web from his one remaining web shooter to catch the car. And the next part is tricky because he has to catch this civilian's hand before it touches the rail, but he doesn't have a web shooter on that side. So he shoots a stream of web from his offhand, catching it with the right hand and puts it where he needs it. And then all that's left to do is catch the last New Yorker with his web shooter hand. And to tie a bow on the whole piece, time speeds back up, we see the New Yorkers narrowly avoid getting fried, and the webhead triumphantly lands on top of the staircase as a classic Hans Zimmer hero motif plays. This is just one example of an action scene from the Amazing Spider-Man movies that I thought was awesome, but there are so many more. For example, we already talked about this visceral web slinging that opens up The Amazing Spider-Man 2, where you really get a sense of speed and fluidity, truly unlike anything we've seen in a Spider-Man movie. But you also have scenes like Gwen's death that doesn't really focus on that stuff, but more just the imagery of it all. In Gwen's last moments, we see Peter stretched incredibly thin, trying to do everything all at once, which is a theme that's in every Spider-Man movie, but it's cool to see it visualized here. Peter struggles to fight Harry, keep the clock tower from breaking down, and keep Gwen from falling to her death all at once. It's the classic Spider-Man dilemma where Peter has to juggle being a superhero and a human being. The tension builds until finally it all comes crashing down. Peter has finally run out of time and can't save Gwen fast enough. And the way that this falling sequence is shot with the music and everything, you can really tell that something bad is about to happen. Normally you wouldn't doubt for a second that Spider-Man would make the save, but this feels different. It only gets more heart-wrenching when we see Peter in denial holding Gwen's lifeless body. And this moment is really propped up by all the other things we've already talked about in this video. Andrew Garfield really sells this painful moment. And part of the reason it hurts so bad is because of how well the movies handled this relationship. I said earlier that this version of Peter is much more broken than others we've seen, and that Gwen was one of the only people that he had in his life. The movie doubles down on this by killing Gwen and making it mostly Peter's fault yet again. Look, I know these movies aren't perfect, but if you don't feel at least something while you watch this scene, then please tell me what it's like to not have a soul. It really is a shame that they never got to make a third movie, because I think this leaves Peter in a very interesting place that we've never quite explored in a Spider-Man movie before. Imagine a Logan-style Amazing Spider-Man 3 where 10 years have passed and Peter still just can't bring himself to be Spider-Man again ever since Gwen's death. That is, until there's some new threat that leads him to begrudgingly come out of retirement. I mean, just take my money now, please. In conclusion, despite what every video essay on YouTube would have you believe, there are some things to like here, and at the end of the day, you like what you like, and there's literally nothing wrong with that. I think especially if you grew up with these movies, then it makes even more sense if you love them. After all, I'm pretty sure most of the Raimi stans only feel that way because of the intense nostalgia they feel with those movies. Andrew Garfield's Spidey will always stick out among the Spider-Men. He was a different type of Peter Parker. I understand that it's not everyone's cup of tea, but to this day, I still love watching these movies. Are they as bad as everyone says? Well, that's up to you, but personally, I found that rarely is a piece of art ever truly objectively bad. In fact, if you watched my MCU Spider-Man video, then you know that there are things that I love about every Spider-Man. Like I said in the beginning of the video, I just love the character. I definitely agree that it's fun to compare these versions and debate who did what best, but just because one is good doesn't make the others any worse, and I really do think that every Spider-Man movie that we've seen thus far, be it Tobey, Andrew, or Tommy, has at least some redeeming qualities. Thank you for watching this video. If you made it this far, then leave a comment down below with your favorite thing about the Amazing Spider-Man movies. Hit like if you enjoyed the video, and you can subscribe for more content. Thanks again, everybody stay gold.